Okay, let's make a start with this week's material. So this week we are really looking at kind of two different portions. We'll start by talking about tissues and classification of body membranes based on those tissues, and then we'll move on to discuss about the skin. So the first part of these recordings is going to be all about the tissues. When we talk about tissues, we're really talking about groups of cells that share a similar structure and similar function. So typically we can classify four primary types of tissue. These primary types of tissues are, I'll present some examples of their functions, but in reality, I think that they are far more diverse. So this is kind of a nutshell version, and we'll build upon that and make it a little bit more extensive as we go through the material later on this course. So let's start with epithelial tissues. These form coverings of the body. So for example, I think a skin would be particularly good one and relevant one, since we'll be talking about that later on this week. We also have connective tissues. These play specifically role in supporting the structure. So it might be very tangible physical support, such as in case of bones, tendons, and ligaments, but it can also be more of a physiological support, such as in case of, for example, blood. We also have our muscle tissues. These are especially relevant when we're talking about movements. So we'll see three different types: skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, and smooth muscles. And final tissue type, a primary tissue type that I have listed for us there, is going to be our nervous tissues. These play an important role in control functions of the body. So to really understand the organs and organ systems, how we have structured our course, I think it's useful that we first start with the tissues. So that's why we're making the starting point there today. But as we move further on our course, our focus will be on those different organ systems. And especially because epithelium is not really covered later, and it is so relevant to the skin that we'll be talking about right after this section. We're going to emphasize on epithelial tissues today. So the term epitheli comes actually from Greek language, and we find epithelial tissues on the surfaces. So they have many different functions. These functions can include, for example, movement of materials across these layers, or especially controlling what gets to pass the layer and what does not. We do see also excretion of materials as particularly relevant to these epithelial tissues. So when we talk about epithelial tissues, let's have a look at some of the characteristics. These are cells that fit together very tightly and in this way form surfaces. They typically have apical surface, which is the free surface at the top. And then we have a basement membrane, which is the cells that, or this kind of structureless material that the cells build up from. You can consider basement membrane almost like a glue that holds that lowermost layers together. And from that layer, we see those cells arising. Also, when we talk about epithelial tissues, we see that we describe them as being avascular. So this means that there's no direct blood supply to these tissues typically. So they receive their nutrients and oxygen, for example, through process of diffusion. We also see that epithelial tissues are characterized by quick regeneration. So they're especially good at dealing with things like need for high rate of recovery or healing. Now, there's going to be two ways or two main methods to classify epithelial tissues, and often we end up seeing that it's actually a combination of these two. So the two methods that we're going to be looking at is focusing on the number of cell layers that we're going to see. And then we're going to be also looking at the shape of the cells on those cell layers, and especially on the outermost membrane, or outermost layer, to be more precise, of these tissues. So let's start by looking at this number of layers to classify tissue types. So when we talk about simple epithelial tissues, we're talking about tissues that have just one single layer. These are particularly well adapted for things like absorption, secretion, and filtration. So because we have this single layer to cross, doing all of these mechanisms, moving the materials across this layer is really, really optimal. So we're seeing again the idea that form and function are complementary to each other. What comes with these simple epithelial tissues, though, having just one layer, is that they're not particularly good for protective functions when it comes to protecting the subsequent layers underneath. We can also have stratified epithelial tissues. Here we have at least 2 cell layers, often much more than just 2. And this multiple layers enables us to have very good durability for these tissues. So really protective functions are what we associate with these stratified epithelial tissues. And let's have a look at the cell shape in classification of epithelial tissues. So when we talk about squamous epithelial tissues, these cells at the outermost layers particularly appear almost like flattened discs. Often textbooks describe these like fish scales. So these are the shape of the cells makes them particularly good for materials passing through and also forming these smooth surfaces for other materials to slide past. So I would think, for example, blood vessels being very good examples of having squamous cells directly in contact with the blood. We want to make it easy to pass across this layer for selective purposes, but we also want the flow to be smooth. When we talk about cuboidal cell shape, what we're seeing is that these cells have kind of a cube-shaped appearance. They almost look like dice if you are into gaming. And then we have a columnar epithelial tissues, columnar epitheliums. Their cells appear like columns, a little bit like pillars of the buildings, if you wish. These are not particularly great for passing materials through them. They more of serve for the purposes of durability. So now let's take off all these classification methods that we've seen and actually put the cell arrangement and cell shape together and have a look how we can make sense of various different epithelial tissue types that we see in the body. So first example that we're seeing here is going to be an example of simple squamous epithelium. So these tissues have one layer of these flattened shaped cells. And these are particularly characteristic for membranes within the body. So some of the examples that I can think of would be, for example, the linings of alveoli, so those little air sacs of the lung, walls of the capillary vessels, so the smallest blood vessels that we see, and the membranes that line or cover organs such as serous membranes. So the functions of these simple squamous epithelia are really the diffusion, filtration, and secretion, so the movement of materials across this layer. So we try to make it as convenient, as easy as possible, but there's still some regulation what gets to pass across this layer and what doesn't. Let's have a look at the next example. Next, we're seeing simple cuboidal epithelium. We find these especially in glands and ducts of glands. So some examples that I can think of would be, for example, kidney tubule walls and surfaces of ovaries, for example. So the functions of simple cuboidal epithelia are really secretion and absorption. We also often see on these simple cuboidal epithelia cilia, these hair-like projections on the surface of these cells. And these cilia help to move material along the surface as they wipe. So I think examples that I can think of would be, for example, moving the egg cell in the uterine tube, or wiping pathogens out of the respiratory tree back towards the throat, so we can swallow and get rid of otherwise of those pathogens. Then the final example that I have of these simple epithelial tissues here is going to be our simple columnar epithelia. Again, very characteristic for linings. For example, we often have glands that secrete these embedded in, for example, goblet cells secreting mucus that forms the mucous membranes. We see simple columnar epithelia also in the linings of the digestive tract. The functions of these epithelial tissue types, simple columnar epithelia, are really secretion, absorption, and also movement if they are ciliated, as we saw earlier on. Then let's have a look at stratified tissues. Stratified tissues are typically named after the outermost, so the free surface, and the cell shape that we see there. So the first one that I have here is going to be stratified squamous epithelia. So these form coverings where there's a lot of friction, so wear and tear. I think a good example of a stratified squamous epithelia would be the skin's outermost portion. We also see these, for example, within the mouth and along the esophagus. So materials move across these tissue types, and as they move across, they have to handle this wear and tear that the materials cause. And finally, I've grouped together the stratified cuboidal epithelia and stratified columnar epithelia. Both serve mainly functions in protection. Actually, the reason why I grouped these together is that both are fairly rare in the human body. We would find these at the ducts of large glands. Then we sometimes have also epithelial tissue types that kind of appear as having multiple layers, but in reality, it is just a single layer of cells. So you remember the word pseudo refers to something being false. So for example, pseudoscience, some examples of pseudoscience, things that are called science but are not real science, would be things like reading tea leaves or astrology or things like that. So like I said, these pseudostratified epithelial tissues are really a single layer, but they appear as stratified because some of the cells are shorter. So we get this variation, especially on the level of where we find nuclei. We find these pseudostratified epithelial tissues, especially in respiratory tract, where they are ciliated, as we discussed earlier, and their function is really the kind of combination of absorption and secretion. And I also wanted to introduce a term of transitional epithelial tissues. So in these transitional epithelial tissues, the shape of the cells depends on the amount of stretching that's happening on that tissue. So we find these where there's a lot of stretch and recoil on epithelial tissues. I think a good example would be, for example, urinary system. At times, we do need to facilitate greater quantity inside the urinary bladder, for example, than at other times, or at times as the urine passes through duct system, there's more of a volume than at other times. I also want to finish the discussion on epithelia by talking a little bit about glandular epithelia. So when we have one or more cells that secrete a product, they form a gland. And these secretions that we're seeing here are molecules that are embedded in a water-based fluid. So there's going to be two main types of glands that we'll talk about. And the first that I'm introducing here is going to be our endocrine glands. So endocrine glands produce hormones, and because hormones are released to the bloodstream, these endocrine glands don't really have ducts. The secretions are simply freed from the gland to the vascular system, where these secretions travel throughout the body to all parts of the body. And we'll talk a lot more about endocrine gland later on this course. I want us to focus instead on exocrine glands. And this is what we normally think of when we think about glands. So these exocrine glands, they do have the gland portion, but they also have the ducts. And these ducts open so that the secretions can be released to the epithelial surface nearby of that gland. And these types of exocrine glands that we're now talking about include oil glands, which we will see, for example, when we talk about skin. These oils that they secrete keep the skin flexible and keep it from drying. We see the same with the oil glands when it comes to the hair, protecting the scalp, giving that flexibility, preventing dryness of the hair. And then we have also sweat glands. And in skin, especially, for example, sweat glands serve an important role of removing wastes and also regulating the body temperature. So a few different things that these can do. And to wrap up, let's have a look of the tissue membranes a little bit. So tissue membranes are when we have thin layers or sheaths of tissues, and they cover a few different places where we can see them covering outside of the body. For example, as it comes to the skin, these tissue membranes can also cover organs. So I think a particularly good example would be pericardium, that connective tissue layer that protects really the heart by forming this sac around the heart. And again, we'll get to talk more about that later on in our studies. We also see these tissue membranes when it comes to internal passageways, for example, stomach mucosa, and also lining the movable joint cavities when we get to look at various different kinds of joints. So they form kind of sacs within those spaces. Let's consider a little bit different kinds of epithelial membranes. So the cutaneous membrane, which is basically our skin, that's the topic that we'll consider next on our course. These are really dry surfaces, the outermost part, protective membrane of the body. And like I said, we'll spend time talking about the role of these cutaneous skin membranes in just a bit. We also have mucous membranes, so sometimes called mucosa. So these have a sticky layer and play a role in humidifying the structure or materials passing by, also capturing a lot of impurities. They line body cavities that are open to the exterior world. And then we have our serous membranes. Serous membranes line cavities that are not open to the outside world. And often there's two layers when it comes to the serous membrane. So pericardium around the heart was one example that I've already touched upon. We'll also see pleura around the lungs and peritoneum that lines the abdominal cavity as examples of some of the serous membranes. And when it comes to the connective tissue membranes, some to consider are really these synovial membranes that line or form the sac of a freely movable joint. So, for example, shoulders, knees, elbows, we have this little sac-like structure where the joint comes together. And I think that this brings us nicely to the end of a basic review of tissues. Our focus has been on the epithelia, and we touched upon a little bit on the classification of the body membranes as well. But we'll take all of this information with us as we move ahead, and we're going to be starting to look at the cutaneous membranes, the skin, and also all the associated structures with the skin when it comes to the integumentary system. So I look forward to seeing you on that video. Until then, bye.